Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevon Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. That's right, nothing but truth bombs here, just like it says in the intro. I am Zevon Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Hey, my apologies that last Thursday's episode wasn't a new one. Hopefully you did enjoy the Bonnie and Clyde Super Drop, but I had intended to put out a new episode. And then I had the sheer audacity to turn on the tap at the bathroom sink and threw my back out. Now, you'd think that people throw their backs out by picking up something heavy or trying some new dance move that they're ill-prepared for, but nope. When you're 6'4", 235 pounds, and over 40 with cerebral palsy, sometimes reaching out to turn on the sink might be all it takes. So I've been laid out for a few days, but here I am now, back, with a brand new episode of Kinda Murdery, and this is a wild true story that raises many questions regarding social prejudice, pseudoscience, whether the ends sometimes justify the means, and most remarkably, is there a such thing as a war oracle? And might magic, yes, I'm talking about Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, magic, even in the 20th century, actually be real? And if it is, does it pose a clear and present danger to the international balance of power? Those are the biggies, and if you'd like to find out the answers to those questions and more, then please join me now as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murdery's Hellish Nell, the Scottish witch Nazi, starts now. On the 23rd day of March in the year 1944, the world was embroiled in the devastating conflict that will be forever remembered as World War II. In London, under a sky heavy with the weight of war and uncertainty, less than 3 years removed from Nazi Germany's hellish Blitz, throngs of people gathered at the Old Bailey. This courthouse, a venerable institution with a history that spanned over 2 centuries, stood as a solemn monument to criminal justice in the British capital. The walls of the Old Bailey had borne witness to an array of court cases that had gripped the nation's attention, some titillating and scandalous, others dark and malevolent. With each step the crowd took toward the Old Bailey, the gravity of the institution's history weighed on them. Its stately architecture, a blend of Romanesque and Baroque styles, commanded respect. The people sensed that they were about to be part of another defining moment in the annals of British justice. From notorious thieves to infamous murderers, the Old Bailey had seen it all. But today was different. Today the case was one that intersected with global affairs, transcending the conventional boundaries of criminality to delve into matters of wartime secrecy, national security, and the very fabric of belief. London, like much of Europe, was a city that had been scarred by the relentless ravages of war, and air raid sirens were as much a part of the city's soundtrack as the chiming of Big Ben. The populace was on edge, always alert for news from the front lines or another air raid warning. Inside this dynamic, three-dimensional backdrop of both triumph and terror, the crowd knew that the case they were about to witness would not just be another entry in the Old Bailey's long ledger of justice served or justice denied. It was a case that had the power to shake the foundations of a nation already unsettled by existential global conflict. In this heavy, charged atmosphere, the public, journalists, lawyers, and assorted onlookers filled the gallery, all sharing an unspoken knowledge that they were about to be part of a courtroom drama unlike any other in recent memory. What lay ahead promised to be a fusion of the mysterious, the political, and the morally ambiguous. A case that, in its implications and outcomes, would echo through the halls of history long after the final verdict was read. On that particular day in March, as the chill of early spring still lingered in the air, the Old Bailey prepared itself for a trial that was a modern anachronism. Centuries had passed since the last person was executed for witchcraft on British soil. And yet, here was Helen Duncan, a medium, standing accused of that ancient offense. Helen's journey to the Old Bailey's venerable courtroom was not a simple one. It was a path interlaced with the volatile elements of state secrets and unexpected raids. Helen was a middle-aged mother of 6 children, a figure seemingly far removed from the world of espionage and wartime intrigue. However, her abilities, or alleged abilities, to communicate with the spirit world had put her squarely in the crosshairs of the wartime establishment. The state believed that she held information that could not be easily explained away, and that her revelations during seances were uncomfortably close to classified secrets. The authorities felt that she posed a risk not only to national security, but also to the public's morale during an era that was, to put it mildly, already fraught with anxiety and dread. Thus, they took swift action, raiding her sessions and ultimately leading her to the heart of the British legal system, where she would face charges that seemed to be a relic of a bygone era, but were all too real and all too now for her. Helen Duncan, sometimes remembered as Scotland's last witch, had become a figure who alarmed the government during a time when a people, a country, and an empire were being forced to confront the very real threat of extermination. This was not merely a trial to determine if Duncan had indeed communicated with the spirit world, but also an examination of how far the powers that be were willing to go to protect their secrets and maintain the public's trust. And so, on that early spring day, the Old Bailey became the epicenter of a case that was as much about the clash of cultural beliefs and the flexing of state power as it was about one woman's alleged dabbling in the occult. The courtroom became a stage where different facets of society converged. Wartime exigencies, deeply ingrained superstitions, and the complex role of women in a world governed by men. You see, it's important to note that throughout history, witchcraft laws and witch trials have often been a tool used by male-dominated societies to silence, disenfranchise, or simply to eliminate women who were deemed troublesome, who defied conventions, or who held property or power that others, meaning men, coveted. Helen Duncan's trial was not just an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader pattern, a modern manifestation of an ancient tactic to control women who did not conform to societal norms. These themes are ever present in the human historical tapestry, going back as far as possible. Back, perhaps, all the way to the Garden of Eden, where, as the story goes, it was Eve who first consorted with the serpent and tricked innocent Adam into that delicious first bite of knowledge, and ultimately into eviction from Eden for them both. In Helen Duncan's case, she had managed to unsettle the very foundations of the wartime establishment, and for that sin she would pay dearly. Born in the late 19th century, in the year 1897 to be exact, Helen McFarlane came into the world in the quaint pastoral town of Callander, Scotland. With its lush landscapes and ancient traditions, Callander was a town steeped in history, but limited in opportunity, particularly for a woman of Helen's peculiar talents. From an early age, it was evident that she was unlike other children in her community. She bore the nickname Hellish Nell, a moniker that hinted at her extraordinary abilities, or what some might have termed abnormality. For Helen wasn't just another young girl navigating the rigors of rural Scottish life. She claimed to possess the ability to see spirits, a gift or a curse, perhaps both, depending on one's perspective. But certainly, it was an ability that for Helen would prove to be a burden, and set her on a path far removed from the norm. Hellish Nell, the young Scottish girl who would later become Helen Duncan, was perceived as a conduit between the realms of the living and the dead, between the palpable world and the mysterious beyond. Her supposed mystical talents didn't go unnoticed. They shaped the contours of her life, both endearing her to some and making her the subject of suspicion and even fear among others. For in those days, even as the world stumbled through the fractious gates of a new century filled with unimaginable technological advancements, ancient beliefs and superstitions still held sway, especially in small communities like Callander, Scotland. Yet, even within the confines of rural Scottish life in the early 1900s, Helen Duncan, Hellish Nell, couldn't be contained. Her alleged otherworldly gifts as a spiritual medium suggested a destiny that exceeded the boundaries of her hometown, a destiny which we now know would eventually lead her to the infamous docks of the Old Bailey, amidst accusations so serious that they merged the realms of wartime statecraft with the arcane laws of witchery. As she grew older, Helen's reputation spread. She became notable, or perhaps notorious. She became famous, or perhaps infamous. People began to seek her out, intrigued by the stories, desperate for a glimpse into the world beyond, or perhaps merely driven by morbid curiosity. Helen was a woman out of time, a relic of ancient beliefs and practices, surviving in a world increasingly governed by reason and technology. But this juxtaposition, the tension between the old and the new, would be the stage upon which Helen Duncan would eventually find herself at the heart of national crisis, as she transformed from Hellish Nell of Callander, Scotland, to a woman who would spook the wartime authorities to such an extent that her freedoms, her very life, would hang in the balance. By 1926, at the age of 29, the woman once known as Hellish Nell had undergone more than just spiritual transformation. After marrying Henry Duncan in 1916, her name changed, and so did the trajectory of her life. No longer confined to her small hometown, she moved to the city of Dundee, Scotland, and it was here that she began her work as a medium in earnest. As the years passed, Helen's reputation grew, and she expanded her operations, taking her talent across the United Kingdom. All the while, she was supporting a family that had grown to include 6 children. She was in many ways a working mother. But her labor was an unusual sort, dealing with the currency of souls and secrets from the other side. The times were ripe for someone of Helen Duncan's abilities. The British populace was psychologically and emotionally raw following the double traumas of World War I and a devastating influenza pandemic. Together, these cataclysms had claimed millions of lives, leaving gaping wounds in the fabric of British society. Grief was an almost universal experience. And answers, any answer, were in high demand. Into this environment stepped Helen Duncan, her services as a medium dovetailing perfectly with the zeitgeist. Spiritualism, the belief system asserting that the living could communicate with the departed, gained enormous traction during the period following the Spanish flu and World War I. It wasn't merely a fringe belief, but had become something of a cultural phenomenon. The populace was primed and ready, searching for comfort, for closure, or even just for the intrigue of something beyond the grim reality that they faced every day. Helen Duncan offered that something more. She tapped into a collective yearning, becoming not just a medium, but a conduit for society's hopes and fears, their unresolved grief and unanswered questions. For many, spiritualism wasn't just mysticism. It was a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of incomprehensible loss and chaos. Helen's services were therefore not merely a curiosity, they fulfilled a deep societal need. But even as she catered to the demands of a grieving nation, her actions set her on a collision course with forces far greater than any individual's quest for understanding. The burgeoning conflict overseas and the ever-watchful eyes of a government entrenched in a new global struggle would soon cast a pall over Helen Duncan's work, transforming her from a figure of curiosity and comfort to one of controversy and criminality. Helen held her seances at the Master's Temple Church of Spiritual Healing in Portsmouth, England. The venue was more than just a place. It was a sanctuary for those seeking spiritual enlightenment and contact with the afterlife. Within the church's walls, Duncan conducted her seances, attracting a devoted following who were eager to experience her proclaimed abilities to communicate with the other side. Unbeknownst to Helen Duncan, an archaic law was lying in wait. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 wasn't designed to condemn actual witchcraft per se, but rather to punish those who claimed to practice it. The legislation was not aimed at rooting out supernatural activities, but rather penalizing deceit. Under the Witchcraft Act of 1735, it was illegal to claim that you had magical powers. It was not necessarily illegal to actually have them. Within the comforting and mystical environment of the Master's Temple Church of Spiritual Healing, Duncan likely never thought that this law, almost 2 centuries old, could become a rope that would entangle her. She wasn't a witch in the traditional sense, she was a medium, a conduit between this world and the next. But in a society on the edge of colossal upheaval, in fact not on the edge, going through colossal upheaval, even the most well-intentioned activities can be viewed through a lens of suspicion, and I'd like to just pause and say that the historical record shows that the vast majority of so-called mediums were not well-intentioned. They were simply con men preying on people's grief. Say what you want about Helen Duncan providing comfort for a grieving populace faced with many, many casualties and losses of loved ones. There may be an element of truth to that, but we should never give a full free pass to someone who chooses to use the emotional vulnerability of someone else who's recently gone through a great tragedy to enrich themselves. Okay, back to the story. The dimly lit rooms of Master's Temple Church were shrouded in an atmosphere thick with anticipation as Helen Duncan conducted a seance. The settings were carefully orchestrated. The light was kept soft and red, just bright enough to make out shapes, but dim enough to preserve the atmosphere of otherworldly mystery. She would sit behind curtains, separating herself from her audience, creating a boundary between the world of the living and whatever realm she claimed to access. As she closed her eyes and slipped into a trance, the room would hold its collective breath. Duncan was not alone in these spiritual ventures. She claimed to have spirit guides, ethereal entities that she named Peggy and Albert. About the least ethereal-sounding names I've ever heard, but it was these guides who led the proceedings, serving as intermediaries between the world of flesh and blood and the world of spirits. Helen Duncan, acting as a conduit, relied on their guidance to navigate the complexities of the afterlife, relaying messages or manifestations from beyond the veil. Then came the part that both enthralled and terrified her audience, the appearance of ectoplasm. Emanating from her mouth and nose, this ghostly white substance seemed to materialize in front of the sitter's eyes. The ectoplasm would take on various forms, sometimes appearing to shape itself into recognizable figures or faces, shocking and amazing to those who witnessed it. For the people in the room, this was proof, tangible and seemingly irrefutable, that Duncan was indeed in contact with the other side. The experience was visceral, the reactions intense. Whether one was a skeptic or a true believer, the appearance of the ectoplasm in that dim red light stirred something deep within the human psyche. For many, it brought a sense of awe or dread or a combination of both, an encounter with something that defied explanation, that pushed the boundaries of what was actually scientifically or rationally possible. However, as astonishing as these manifestations were, they would also become a focal point of intense scrutiny and suspicion. Duncan's mystical performances, so compelling in the eyes of her believers, would draw the kind of attention that could place her very freedom, or perhaps even her life, in jeopardy. It was an unsettling paradox. The very acts that made her a sought-after medium were the same that would put her in peril. As society and the government began to view her activities through an increasingly skeptical and alarmed lens. As the years passed, Helen Duncan's reputation continued to swell, expanding far beyond the spiritualist communities and reaching into mainstream consciousness. With greater fame, however, became greater scrutiny. One such skeptic was Harry Price, a physical researcher known for his investigations into paranormal phenomena. Intrigued and suspicious, he secured Duncan's permission for an in-depth examination in the year 1931. Price approached his investigation with a critical eye, treating Duncan's seances not as spiritual experiences, but as phenomena to be explained. What he found, or at least what he believed he found, cast serious doubt on the authenticity of Duncan's abilities. According to Price, the so-called ectoplasm that Duncan produced during her sessions was nothing more than cheesecloth and egg whites, substances she ingested before the seance and later regurgitated. Adding further skepticism to his report, he noted that the spirits that Duncan allegedly materialized appeared to be more akin to dolls than actual human forms. Despite Price's damning conclusions, his investigation did little to quell the enthusiasm of Duncan's loyal following. Those who believed in her abilities remained steadfast, unperturbed by the skepticism that surrounded her. They continued to throng to her seances, eager to experience what they saw as genuine contact with the afterlife. The world around them, however, was undergoing profound changes. The United Kingdom was careening toward another catastrophic conflict. The atmosphere was heavy with tension and impending doom as the country braced itself for what would become World War II. It was during this fraught time that Duncan's services as a medium would not only remain in demand, but become the focus of a government deeply concerned with matters of national security. The trajectory of her life had always been extraordinary, from her early days in Calendar to her ascension as a renowned medium. But as Britain prepared for another global conflict, Helen Duncan would find herself in an extraordinary set of circumstances that would place her gifts, whether real or fraudulent, under the harshest light yet, even catching the attention of wartime authorities. For Duncan, the coming years would bring not just fame but also notoriety, and an ordeal that would etch her name in the annals of British legal history. The impact of World War II was felt across every sector of British society, from the average citizen to institutions, and as it would turn out, even in the spiritual realm. With the United Kingdom officially at war as of September 3, 1939, a heightened sense of vigilance permeated the nation. The government clamped down on the dissemination of information, not just to maintain high spirits among the populace, but also to prevent sensitive military details from leaking out. The stakes were unimaginable. Loose lips could, after all, potentially sink ships. Amidst this climate of heightened secrecy and paranoia, a peculiar debate began to emerge in the tabloid press. The topic? Mediums. And the question they were asking was as outrageous as it was logical within the context of war. Could mediums, inadvertently or otherwise, serve as conduits for intelligence leaks? If they were capable of summoning spirits, particularly those of fallen soldiers, what was to prevent enemy agents from extracting invaluable information during seances? Helen Duncan, for her part, was not conducting seances to assist Nazis or compromise British interests. At least there's no direct evidence that she was. Nevertheless, the wartime atmosphere enveloped her just as it did everyone else. And then, on May 24, 1941, during a seance in Edinburgh, an event occurred that would drastically alter the course of her life and put her squarely in the crosshairs of the authorities. A spirit purportedly came forward with staggering news. A British warship had been sunk. The revelation was not just shocking, it was potentially explosive. In a country on edge and a government desperate to control the narrative of the war, Duncan's claim, whether true or false, had the potential to wreak havoc. It raised questions that went beyond the ethics or validity of her work as a medium. Now the concerns were strategic and national in scale. If what the spirit had disclosed was accurate, then Helen Duncan was in possession of information that the government would likely deem sensitive, even classified. Whether she sought it or not, Duncan had stepped onto a perilous path, one fraught with consequences far beyond the skepticism or admiration that had hitherto defined her public life. In the world of spooks, ghosts, no, not seances and mediums, but intelligence and espionage, nothing creates more of a stir than when confidential information surfaces in unexpected places. Roy Firebrace, Scotland's chief of military intelligence, was privy to many of the nation's secrets. He attended Duncan's seance in Edinburgh out of curiosity or perhaps even skepticism, but what he encountered that evening caught him completely off guard. Helen Duncan, a medium with no official links to military intelligence, seemed to know something that even he, a high-ranking official, was not yet aware of. The HMS Hood had been sank in the Battle of Denmark Strait. After the seance, Firebrace moved swiftly to verify Duncan's claims. What he found was astonishing. The medium was correct. The Hood had been lost, taking hundreds of sailors down with it. For Firebrace, the revelation presented an unsettling conundrum. How had Duncan come into possession of classified information before him, a man at the very epicenter of the nation's intelligence network? And we're going to stop there for today, but if you'd like to find out more about the amazing true story of Helen Duncan, please rejoin me this Thursday for Part 2, the thrilling conclusion of Hellish Nell, the Scottish witch Nazi. Until then, I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.